According to the results of a study by the Bertelsmann Foundation, 2/3 of Germans believe in life after death, in the immortality of the soul, or in reincarnation. In the Far East, that is, in countries shaped by Buddhism or Hinduism, the percentage of people who believe in reincarnation and the law of cause and effect, usually called the law of karma there, is far higher. According to the psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, the teaching of reincarnation belongs to the archetypes of human knowledge. Archetypes are unconscious imprints, so-called primitive mental images, which, from deep within the subconscious, influence human behavior and the conscious mind. This would explain why so many people, regardless of origin, skin color, religion, or their cultural environment, believe in reincarnation. According to the theory of the Protestant and Catholic churches, the doctrine of reincarnation is not part of the Christian faith. Curia Cardinal Professor Dr. Walter Kasper is of the opinion that modern ideas of reincarnation are incompatible with the Christian hope of eternal life, and Catholic theologians agree with this. John Paul II wrote in an apostolic letter, November 10, 1994, "Christian revelation excludes reincarnation." But here a distinction should be made. Does the teaching of reincarnation merely contradict the theological doctrine and dogma of the churches? Or does it actually contradict the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth? Moreover, the question arises, how can the churches decide what is Christian and what is not? How can the theologians be sure to know exactly what Jesus of Nazareth taught and did not teach? What does the Bible actually say about reincarnation? One thing can be clearly stated. Nowhere does the Bible speak out against reincarnation. The efforts of dogmatists to deduce from the words of the Bible a rejection of this doctrine do not stand up to close scrutiny. On the other hand, it is difficult to deny that there are indeed references to the teaching of reincarnation in the Bible. For example, in the original Greek text of the letter of James, in connection with the effect of false speech that can cause a fire, there is even the expression wheel of birth, which can thereby be set in motion again. The wheel of birth is a well-known term for reincarnation. In the Gospel of Luke, the following has been passed down. Jesus was praying alone and the disciples were with him. And he asked them, "Who do the people say I am?" And they answered, "Some say John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and others that one of the old prophets has risen." Luke chapter 9, verse 18. This incident suggests that at the time of Jesus of Nazareth, knowledge of reincarnation was common. And in the book of Wisdom, chapter 8, verses 19 and 20, there's a clear reference to the pre-existence of the soul. The author of this part of the Bible says about himself, "As a child I was by nature well endowed, and a good soul fell to my lot. Or rather, being good, I entered an undefiled body." However, one should also be aware that the Bible did not fall from heaven, but was written, sorted, often corrected and changed by people. Moreover, until the end of the 4th century, the emerging power church favored only a small selection from the existing scriptures. The 4 Gospels, which today make up the so-called New Testament, were thus arbitrarily selected from a great number of Gospels, and according to some criteria or other. At that time, the Church of Rome was strongly promoted by Emperor Constantine, and as early as 380, Emperor Theodosius declared it the sole state religion. Non-Catholics, or those who did not fully submit to the Catholic Church, were even threatened with the death penalty. The first to be executed was the Spanish Bishop of Avila, Priscillian. He was an ascetic mystic and regarded the Christian life as a constant conversation with God. He also thought highly of Gospels that today are considered apocryphal, that is, not recognized, because they were rejected by the church at that time. He taught that slavery was abolished by Jesus of Nazareth. He also called for equality between men and women. In addition, for him the belief in reincarnation and vegetarianism was part of the original Christian body of thought. However, these points seem to be exactly the ones in Jesus' teaching that were a powerful thorn in the side of the Catholic Church, and therefore had already been removed from the official writings. Priscillian was sentenced to death and executed with 6 of his followers in Trieste, Germany in 385. His offense? He aspired to a highly ethical Christianity, was a vegetarian, and valued prophecy. Until that time, the highest church punishment had been excommunication at most. From then on, deviants, or so-called heretics, were threatened with torture and death. At about the same time, the scholar and theologian Jerome became secretary to Pope Damasus I and was commissioned by him to compile a unified Latin text from the selected writings. This text, known as the Vulgate, would in the future contain the scriptures and gospels that would be the ones held valid for all people. Of the original Christian teachings, which said that Jesus taught equality between men and women and abolished slavery, and for which Priscillian was executed, there is nothing left in this selection of scriptures in the Bible. Also about the topics like reincarnation or Jesus' love for animals, thus the vegetarianism of the early Christians, one finds virtually nothing more in the Bible, held until today to be valid. Jerome, however, must have known that reincarnation was a component of early Christian teachings. In a letter he writes about the early Christian teacher Origen, 185 to 254, that according to his teaching, the soul of human beings changes its body. And in the letter against John of Jerusalem, paragraph 19, Jerome quotes the writings of Origen, even with references, with the following words: "All bodiless and invisible, reasonable creatures by slow degrees sink to the lowest step, that is, to flesh and blood, when they lapse into negligence and take on a body according to the kind and place to which they lower themselves. They change their bodies as often as they change their resting places in going from heaven to earth." That Jerome omitted or had to omit some things that were known to him from early Christian tradition can also be seen from the fact that he clearly quotes certain topics in his letters and the teachings of Jesus, but without mentioning them in his translation. About the eating of meat, for example, he writes in a letter, "Jesus Christ has come and turned the end into the beginning, so that we are no longer allowed to eat flesh." As already mentioned, this teaching of Jesus of Nazareth is completely missing in the Bible translated by Jerome. It can be assumed that he was under great pressure, because similar accusations were also raised against Jerome as against Priscillian and his friends, who were tortured and beheaded in Trieste at that time. When Pope Damasus I died, Jerome fled to Bethlehem soon after to escape condemnation. The Gospels, which were not included in the selection even in the early days, had to be burned at that time. Under penalty of death, it was prohibited to possess such writings. That today's so-called apocryphal, that is, hidden Gospels nevertheless exist, is due to the fact that, to save them from destruction, some people buried these writings in the desert or hid them in caves. This is the only reason why today we again have the knowledge of such Gospels, which were rejected by the Church and were not included in the Bible. Issue 4 from 2016 of the well-known German magazine Geo bears the main title, What the Bible Keeps Secret, and as subtitle, The Other Jesus and the Hidden Sides of Christendom. In a major research, it is pointed out that ancient scripture findings in the Egyptian desert paint a very different picture of Jesus of Nazareth and early Christianity than what the Bible and the churches would have us believe. For example, a reference to reincarnation is found in the Gospel of Thomas, which, along with 13 other leather-bound books, were found in 1945 by two farmers in Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. Verse 84 says, "Today, when you see your image, you rejoice. But when you see your images that came into being before you, how much you will have to bear." With images that came into being before you is undoubtedly meant our pre-existences. And the question of how much we would endure if we had knowledge of our pre-existences is certainly a legitimate question. The knowledge of our deeds from previous lives could possibly burden us and make us unfree. On this very point, more detailed texts are found in the ancient Coptic manuscript also found in Egypt, near Luxor, in 1769, the so-called Pistis Sophia. The handwritten codex is now kept in the British Museum in London. This ancient text shows us deeper aspects of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth to his disciples. The origin of the writings and letters found goes back to the 1st and 2nd centuries. In one of these scriptures, Jesus explains, among other things, the reason why we do not remember our pre-existences as follows. "And one brings the cup with the water of forgetfulness and hands it to the soul, and it drinks it and forgets all things in all places to which it had gone. And they cast it," meaning the soul, "into a body in which it will spend its time." So the symbolic term "cup with the water of forgetfulness" wants to show us that we cannot remember our previous incarnations. Thus, people have the chance to cope with their lives once again in a new and better way. A person will, if it is meant to be, meet with the right people and come into certain life situations, and can thus react without the awareness of a previous burden. From this point of view, there is no coincidence in our life. In the Gospel of Pistis Sophia, Jesus speaks of a circuit, or about circuits of the changes of the body. For instance, of a situation when a soul may not be able to go on high to the light and must return into a change of the body. In a reincarnation, a person would, so Jesus, be cast back into the world again, according to the type of the sins which he hath committed. Thereby the soul receives a body that is according to the type of sins it has committed. So the law of cause and effect is also illustrated very clearly in this handwritten fragment. It is described how an arrogant person can incarnate into a certain situation, into a certain body, where he has the best conditions and chances to recognize himself and to mature. In this context, it is also important to know that according to Jesus' explanations, no soul is forced to be reborn. In the intermediate world, there would also be the possibility to improve one's own situation and spiritual growth. This would be decided by the soul itself. It feels how strong the magnetism for an incarnation is, and where and how the chances for an improvement of its situation are best. And the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, "You will not get out of there until you have paid the last penny," are explained in this ancient gospel. According to this teaching of Jesus of Nazareth to his disciples that has been passed down, it is about reconciling with your enemies while still in this life, since otherwise one would have to make up for it in a new incarnation. In these examples of conversations between Jesus of Nazareth and his disciples, the process and goal of reincarnation becomes clear. The possibility of a new incarnation should help the soul to recognize and discard its transgressions, so that one day it will become pure and divine again and can return home to the eternal homeland, just as Christ promised us. In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. John chapter 14, verses 2 and 3. How present the teaching of reincarnation was in early Christianity can be seen in the writings of the great early Christian teacher Origen. He was the best known scholar of Christian antiquity. The well-known Catholic dogmatics professor, Dr. Franz Dijkamp, paraphrases the belief of Origen with the words, "Spiritual beings would be incarcerated in a body for the second or third time, or even more often, in order to return in their former sinless and bodiless state after the completed purification." Even though Origen's writings had already been falsified or destroyed by church representatives by the end of the 4th century, his teachings spread over large parts of Europe as so-called Arianism. For the Church, this was pure heresy, and it therefore incited the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian to wage war against the Arian-minded Ostrogoths in Italy. In preparation for this war of extermination, Justinian had the teachings of Origen, as far as they were still known at the time, banned in 9 martial-sounding anathemas, or curses, at a synod of the Eastern Church in Constantinople in 543. These were confirmed 10 years later at a council and can be read in the official textbook, The Teaching of the Catholic Church by Neuner and Roos, under margin note 199. There it says, among other things, "If anyone say that human souls had a previous existence and have turned to evil and in punishment have been banished into bodies, anathema sit," which basically means eternally damned. Origen taught neither about an eternal hell nor an eternal damnation. Probably for this reason, another curse is documented under margin note 808. "If anyone says or believes that the punishment of wicked men is but temporary, and that after a certain time it will end and there will be restitution, anathema sit." With these curses by the council, the ground was cut from under the early Christian teaching of reincarnation. Reincarnation was not explicitly mentioned in these curses, but the prerequisite for it. The pre-existence of the soul and also the goal of reincarnation, the so-called restitution of all things, that is, the teaching that all people and all souls will one day be with God again. This teaching thereby clearly excludes eternal damnation. Is this the reason why the emerging state church so vehemently opposed the teaching of reincarnation and still rejects it today? Does it fear that otherwise, the structure of church dogma, which also includes eternal damnation, might collapse like a house of cards? Therefore, the question arises, how can the Protestant and Catholic churches be so sure that the teaching of reincarnation contradicts Christian doctrine?
Und schreckst und selber herein, du bist
But time does not stand still, and more suppressed knowledge is brought to the attention of the public. Moreover, the rumors do not want to be silenced, that in the Vatican secret archives, even more such ancient writings are stored, which could clearly testify to the teaching of reincarnation and also to Jesus' love for animals. That the teaching of reincarnation, which Jesus of Nazareth obviously taught to his disciples, was banned from church Christianity, could have unforeseeable and serious consequences until today. Who knows how history would have proceeded if people had known that their negative actions could fall back on them in this or another life on earth, if they were not repented and resolved in time. Instead, for centuries, people were sold indulgences for murder and every conceivable crime, with the promise that they would thereby immediately go to heaven after their death. And this without them having to recognize, repent, and change their behavior and actions on this earth. Even today, in the 21st century, millions of pilgrims are regularly lured to Rome because of the alleged gates of indulgence. Could the teaching of reincarnation become dangerous to the Church's arrogated monopoly over the salvation of its believers? Is that why all the communities and their supporters, who still believed in the original teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and in reincarnation and tried to live them, were persecuted and killed throughout the centuries? Think of the Cathars, the Bogomils, and many other original Christian groups during the Middle Ages that were mercilessly persecuted by the Catholic Church and in some cases tortured and executed. Is that why all of those who believe in reincarnation are still placed into an esoteric corner by the churches today? The teaching of reincarnation could change the way we look at the world and our relationship with our fellow people in many ways. People with whom we had something to clear up, but instead we prefer to avoid, could meet us again sooner or later, possibly in another incarnation, as if by chance, perhaps as a child or partner, until everything is clarified. Or as the Bible puts it, until you have paid the last penny. Viewed in this way, wouldn't the term enemy become an irrational concept? If one believes in reincarnation, then it is only in the current incarnation of a soul which is seen as enemy and is possibly fought against. In a previous or following life, this same soul, which is currently considered an enemy, could possibly be or have been the brother or sister, father or son, mother or daughter, etc. of the one who is currently fighting this soul in a human garment. The spiral of violence will continue through incarnations until one renounces hatred and becomes reconciled. This could be the explanation why there are feuds and enmities in families that last for generations and wars between certain countries again and again. Injustice, wars, crusades, oppression against peoples and countries, this negative energy is not lost, but sooner or later comes back to the perpetrator. With this knowledge, it would also be highly counterproductive and pointless to counter violence with even more violence, hatred with even more hatred. Closely connected with the teaching of reincarnation is the law of cause and effect, of sowing and reaping, also called the law of karma in the East. There are also many testimonies to this in the Bible. For example, the Apostle Paul said, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a person sows, that shall he also reap." The Bible often uses the term sowing and reaping. Job, for example, said, "As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same." Chapter 4, verse 8. Another quote from a psalm reads, His mischief returns upon his own head, and on his own pate his violence descends. Chapter 7, verse 16. God spoke through the prophet Isaiah, "Woe to the wicked! It shall be ill with him, for what his hands have done shall be done to him." Chapter 4, verse 11. And the Lord also warned through the prophet Jeremiah, "Your ways and your doings have brought this upon you. This is your doom, and it is bitter. It has reached your very heart." Chapter 4, verse 18. And in his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus of Nazareth taught the law of sowing and reaping very vividly and with many examples. "For with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get." Chapter 7, verse 2. In another place, he even said, "For the one who takes up the sword will perish by the sword." This means that everything that goes out from a person comes back to that person, unless he has recognized his wrongdoing, repented and changed, and if possible, made amends for the damage. But although these lawful principles are in the Bible, they are not really taught by the churches. For people living in the East, the teaching of reincarnation and the law of cause and effect are taken for granted. As a result, these people have a different view of their lives and of what is happening in this world than someone who does not believe in reincarnation and in the law of cause and effect and has not been familiar with this knowledge from childhood. You can see events in a larger context. This is shown by an event that shook humankind deeply a few years ago: the tsunami. While, for example, Muslims in Thailand and in Indonesia assert that the tsunami was a punishment from Allah because they thought they saw the word Allah on an aerial photograph of the deadly waves, Robert Zoltich, former Archbishop of Freiburg and chairman of the German Bishops' Conference, said in an interview with the news magazine Der Spiegel on February 20th, 2011, in response to the question, "Why does God allow earthquakes and tsunamis?" God may have created the world, but he did not regulate every detail. The Buddhists in Thailand, who believe in reincarnation and in the law of karma, did not see any higher powers at work, but only human beings who did not live in accord with nature, but plundered it to their own advantage. They said that nature had warned people by way of this catastrophe, so that they would change their ways and respect nature, as reported in Spiegel on March 14, 2005, in an inquiry on the tsunami. Whether this event, which was understood by the Buddhists as a warning, actually resulted in change toward nature and animals in the behavior of the affected people is not clear from this report. Nevertheless, couldn't this point of view, to see human beings as perpetrators who no longer live in harmony with nature but plunder creation for their own benefit, be a good approach toward reflecting on human behavior toward Mother Earth? Analysis and connections of this kind are rarely or never found in the Western world. The cause is usually sought with nature, or the blame is even sought with God, who has supposedly forsaken us. If one reads the wisdom of the Sermon on the Mount with the knowledge of reincarnation and the law of sowing and reaping, then one inevitably reaches the conclusion that Jesus of Nazareth came to this earth so that people would recognize the cause of their suffering, that they would stop accumulating even more guilt, that they would become humble and helpful. With impressive appeals, the so-called Beatitudes, he shows people the way out of the law of sowing and reaping, and thus out of the wheel of reincarnation. According to this teaching, there is only one way out of the wheel of reincarnation: to recognize one's own faults, one's own guilt, to ask forgiveness for the harm done to others, and to make amends if there is possibility for this. And above all, the honest resolution not to repeat the mistakes. This principle applies to individuals as well as to whole nations, races, and institutions. According to this knowledge, no ceremony, no ritual, no external religion, and no priest can take from a person the work on oneself. How helpful and wise the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth are can be seen from this one sentence from the Sermon on the Mount. But why do you see the splinter in your brother's eye and are not aware of the beam in your own eye? When we argue with our neighbor or get upset about someone's behavior, we usually blame the other person. Rarely do we see the fault in ourselves. But Jesus of Nazareth taught us, it is indeed the splinter in the eye of the other that bothers us. But the splinter is, in reality, only a projection of the beam in our own eye. Therefore, we project our misbehavior onto our neighbor. Whoever takes to heart this one sentence from Jesus of Nazareth's treasure of wisdom and tries to apply it in everyday life will have astonishing experiences. The advocates of the doctrine of reincarnation emphasize that the principle of reincarnation has nothing to do with self-redemption, as theologians repeatedly claim. They are convinced that the Redeemer power of Christ of God enables people to get up again and again with His help. It helps us recognize mistakes and to change our ways from within again and again. According to the mystics of many centuries and the revelations of the present time, it is this Redeemer power, this energetic spark, which was given to all people and souls, according to the words of Jesus, "It is finished." It prevents the degeneration of everything created, the threatening dissolution of God's creation, as it was recognized by the Indian seers and other mystics in the East more than 2 millennia ago, and described as the dissolution of all forms, or nirvana. However, since the degeneration, that is, the regression of the soul, was stopped by the deed of redemption according to the early Christian teaching, it is also not possible to incarnate into an animal body. In this context, the event of Golgotha sounds quite different from the church doctrine that says that on the cross, Jesus of Nazareth atoned for and took away all the sins of the world. On the one hand, this obviously did not happen, as can easily be ascertained with one look at this world. On the other hand, the following question must be allowed. What would be the use of taking away a person's burden without his realizing the reasons for it, and without his repenting of it and changing his life? Wouldn't he continue to go through life with the same habits and immediately burden himself anew and fall back into his old ways? Whether all human beings bear within a spark of energy, the Redeemer spark from Christ, can probably be determined only by each one for themselves, by trying to ignite this spark and honestly turning to Christ. Back to the teaching of reincarnation. As explained, among other things, it can be reconstructed very well with some ancient fragments of scriptures, as they were found in the desert in Egypt and which were not censored by ecclesiastical authorities. These show that the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth, as it is handed down today in the Bible, is incomplete. But in the present time, there are other ways to learn what Jesus of Nazareth really taught. Since the mid-70s, the divine world has again been speaking directly through the prophetic word, especially for the people in this important time of upheaval. In today's technologically advanced world, these revelations are available to all seeking people worldwide. The work translated into many languages, "This is my word, Alpha and Omega, the Gospel of Jesus," provides detailed information about the life of Jesus and his teachings on more than 1,000 pages. The essence of these prophetic words does not contradict the relics of ancient manuscripts found in the desert. Through the prophetic spirit, however, it is conveyed and deepened today much more extensively, in greater detail, more directly, and especially tailored to the understanding and consciousness of today's humankind. Again and again it is emphasized, to know about the law of cause and effect does not mean at all that we can see through the life of others, their blows of fate and suffering, in order to pass judgment on them in a self-righteous way. For one thing, the network of entanglements over several lives on earth is highly complex and can hardly be summarized with our human consciousness on this side of life. Moreover, such an arrogant attitude would only be our undoing and would burden us. And one thing we should consider: who already knows their own fate and what will still come toward them in this or perhaps in a further life? Rather, Jesus of Nazareth teaches us to practice mercy and to stand by our neighbor when they need help. Although the doctrine of reincarnation and the law of sowing and reaping is perceived by many people as coherent and logical, people living in the West have not learned to recognize and take seriously the harbingers or warnings that often precede a blow of fate. This applies to our own personal life as well as to worldwide events. The looming climate catastrophe is one example. Many causes are known, but is humankind willing to turn around and give up habits that harm the climate, the environment, or the animals? For example, for profit reasons in agriculture, the soil is sprayed and worked with poison and chemicals worldwide, although everyone knows that this kills the important microorganisms and thus the life in the soil. Who thinks about the following generations or about their future incarnations? Maybe there will be no more chemical fertilizers and sprays, and one will have to try with little success to grow food on dead soil. Another example: according to UN publications, meat production is responsible for over 50% of harmful greenhouse gases worldwide. But what consequences do the majority of people draw from this? And quite apart from the consequences of consumption for the climate, is how animals are treated worldwide today ethically justifiable? Everything could be completely different. Let us watch the children. In a zoo, it's a joy watching them feed and pet sheep with their little lambs and so much love and devotion. The horses with their little foals are also a great attraction. If one were to ask children whether a sheep or a little lamb should be killed so that they can eat it afterward, this would cause a great lack of understanding, wild protest, and many cries. At home, therefore, children are not told where the minced meat in the lasagna and the sausage comes from. They first get used to it, until it becomes normal for them, a matter of course, a thoughtless habit, a kind of dependence. Until they need it every day, until they perhaps even sneer at or ridicule others who refrain from it. This is just one example of how causes are often set unconsciously and how human beings, without realizing it, can become part of a global effect. They do not even have to be perpetrators. Even as consumers or educators, they can be a trigger or part of a chain reaction. Because the teaching of reincarnation says, we are responsible for our life, our thoughts, for everything we do and do not do, and for everything that happens to us. And therefore, we have to bear the consequences ourselves. Also concerning our behavior toward animals and nature. This knowledge makes people more critical of themselves, in terms of their thoughts and actions, which could be followed by effects in this or a later life. But we should also not resign ourselves and say, this is my fate, I can't change anything about it now. Exactly the opposite is the case. Everything is in motion, and ultimately, everything depends on our thoughts and actions. According to the teaching of reincarnation, every human being on this earth has once again been given the chance to purify their being, their soul, so that after this earthly existence, they return to the kingdom of light from where every soul once went forth. For it is not the will of God that the souls reincarnate continuously. Rather, it is God's desire that we return to Him forthwith, back to our spiritual families, back to our spiritual dwelling planets.